are continuing with our discussion on computer networks as a part of the series, and in the last lecture we were talking about the FTP or the file transfer protocol, which is a part of the standard client server protocols of the TCP/IP protocol suite. And we had seen that when data transfer, when a file needs to be uploaded or downloaded from a client to the server and vice versa, so FTP is the simplest and the most elegant solution, which is available for us. The reason being that FTP provides us with two types of connections. So when a client or a server, when a client is trying to contact a server, so two types of connections are established. One will be the control connection and the other will be the data connection. So the control connection will be basically a connection which will remain live, which will remain active throughout the data exchange process, and it is going to periodically convey the status, and for every control request that the client will send, it will always generate one response from the server. So this was a little about the control connections that we have already discussed so far. Now we are looking at the data connections. So data connections, basically they use the port number 20 at the server side. So we had also seen that two ports are going to be used. The standard ports which FTP uses will be port number 20 for a data connection and port number 21 for control connection. So now however, the creation of a data connection is different from the creation of a control connection. So control connection, we saw that the client sends a request with the status and a code, and a control connection is established by the server. Now what happens when the client is trying to create a data connection? So there are three steps which are involved in this. The client, not the server, will issue a passive open request, right, through a temporary port. So this must be done by the client because it's the client which is wanting the transfer of file to take place. So the client will send a request. Now using the port command, the client sends this port to the server because the client has created a temporary port. So the port has to be conveyed to the server using a control command, and then the server will receive the port number and it will issue an active open using the well known port number 20, because port number 20 is the one which is going to be used for data exchange, and the received ephemeral port. So three things are done. The client will send the port to the client will open the request and it will set a port, a temporary port, will convey that temporary port to the server, and the server will receive the port and it will say that okay, now the communication has been opened, and it will use two ports now, port number 20 and the temporary port number which was sent to the server by the client. Now communication over data connections, how does data connection communication will happen? So basically the purpose now is different. Communication on a control connection is happening for communication of status updates and control information, but on a data connection, basically the transfer of files is going to take place. So the client has to define three things when the file needs to be transferred. What is the type of the file to be transferred, what is the structure of the data, and what will be the transmission mode, because when two systems are transferring data, so we had seen initially also that this is a problem when file transfer is happening or data exchange is happening, that the files, the file structure may be different, the file naming conventions may be different, the way directories are stored may be different. So the client has to define very categorically what type of file, what is the structure of the data, and what is the transmission mode that it wants the data to be sent. So before sending the file through the data connection, we prepare for transmission through the control connection, right, because this is how the problem of heterogeneity will be resolved. On the internet, the problem of heterogeneity will be resolved when you have these three types of attributes, that is the type, the structure and the transmission mode of the data communication. Now, when we say file type, so file type we can mean it could be an ASCII file, it could be an image file, it could be a extended binary coded decimal file. So, any type of file can be transferred using the FTP. Data structure of a particular file can also differ, because FTP can transfer a file across data connection using any of the interpretations of the structure of data. That is, it could be a file structure, it could be a record structure, or it could be a page structure. So, when we say that it's the structure of the file is a file structure format, which is actually the default format. So, it means that there is no structure and the continuous streams of bytes are going to flow from one end to the other. But when we say that it is a record structure, so we mean that records of the file, the entire file will be divided into records, and this is only done with text files. And the third structure which can be allowed on FTP is the page structure, that is, the file will be divided into multiple pages. Each page will have a page number, a page header, and the pages can be stored and accessed randomly or sequentially, any which way. So, therefore, this also has to be intimated by the client to the server, that whether the transfer will be on a record structure, on a page structure, or on a file structure. Then the transmission mode also has to be defined, because FTP can transfer a file across the data connection using either stream mode or block mode or compressed mode. So, stream mode is the default mode in which data is delivered from FTP to TCP as a continuous stream of bytes. That is what the name suggests, stream mode. In block mode, data will be delivered in blocks. So, each block will be preceded by a 3-byte header, and file transfer actually will occur over the data connection under the control of the command sent over the control connection. So, therefore, we have to remember that file transfer in FTP will mean three things can happen. First is that a file is being retrieved from the server to a client. Second thing is that the client is trying to store a file on the server, so the movement is client to server. And the third is directory listing, that is, the client is wanting to know what all files are stored on the server, so that is again server to client. So, three types of data flow can happen, either it can be retrieving a file, it can be storing a file, or it can be directory listing services. So, FTP is a very robust platform for exchange of files, but then there is another concern which is there, that when FTP was actually designed, that time security was not a big concern, right, and therefore FTP, even if it requires a password, it is also sent in plain text, that is, it is not encrypted format of the file. So, therefore it means that it can be easily intercepted and used by any attacker. So, therefore data transfer connection also transfers data in plain text, which is also insecure. So, therefore, to be secure and to have a layer of encryption on your password or on your data itself, a secure socket layer or an SSL needs to be put between the FTP application layer and the TCP layer. So, in this case, the FTP will be called as a SSL FTP. Just like we said, HTTP will be called as HTTPS. Here again, FTP will be an SFTP, that is secure socket layer FTP, it will be called. So, this is one part of the protocols. Now, another protocol which is quite different from these, although it is also a client server protocol, but the way this protocol works is different from what we have seen in the case of HTTP or FTP, is the electronic mail or email. Now, we all understand that the purpose of email is to allow exchange of messages through the network, right, but this application, the way it is designed will be different, because in case of HTTP or FTP, the server program is always running, it is running at all the time, right, and it's waiting for a request from a client. This is what we have seen. But when the request arrives, the server will provide the service. So there is a request and there is a response immediately. But in case of an email, the situation is different, because email is actually one way transaction. If a person sends an email to another person, then they may expect a response, but it is not mandatory. And even if the other person will respond, that will also be a one way transaction, because again the receiver, or who was the original sender, may or may not respond. So therefore this problem, that all the time the other person will be available to receive the response, is not a viable solution, right, because it is not feasible also, it is not logical also, that every person will run a server program and wait until someone sends an email to them, right. So they may want to turn off their computer and they may want to leave, right. So you cannot keep your computer on in waiting for a email to appear, waiting for an email to be received, right. So therefore the client server programming idea is implemented in email, but it is done using a different methodology. Now what is that different methodology? That is using intermediate computers or servers. So the user will only run client programs when they want, and the intermediate servers apply the client server paradigm. So instead of having one client and server interaction, we will also have another layer of servers which we will call as the mail servers or the intermediate servers, which will handle this task, which will remain available 24/7 to receive the email in case they are received by the client. So if we look at the architecture of how the whole thing works, it's very interesting to see that there are two people, say for instance Alice and Bob. So first person is Alice, and both of them have a similar structure. They have mail servers, as we were just talking. So they have three components now. In this entire architecture, we are looking at three components. We have user agents, that is UA. We have the message transfer agent, the MTA, and we have the message access agent or the MAA. So there are two UAs. There are two pairs of message transfer agents, that is one for the client and one for the server, and there is a pair of message access agent, that is one for the client and one for the server. Now let us see how this is going to work, and also we can see that there is a spool which is there. Spool basically means the queue, that while a message is being sent, it can be stored in the spool. So that queue or that waiting area, that buffer is also there. So the sender and the receiver of the email, they are connected, they can be connected via a LAN or a WAN to two mail servers. The administrator has created one mailbox for each user where the received messages are going to be stored. So mailbox is nothing but it's a location on the server. It's a part of the hard drive of the server, and it has got special permission restrictions. That is, only the person who is the owner of the mailbox can access the mailbox. So the administrator is going to create this kind of folders, you can say, this kind of areas on the hard disk, which will be the mailboxes of the individual users, and they will also create a spool. That's like we were saying, the spool or the queue to store messages which are waiting to be sent. So while the message is in the transit, it will be stored in the spool or the queue so that it is not lost. So now when one person will need to send a message to another person, so they will use their user agent program to prepare the message and send it to the mail server. Now the mail server at the sender's site will use a queue to store the messages waiting to be sent. So this message will also become a part. The message, however, needs to be sent through the internet from the sender's site to the receiver's site using a message transfer agent. So here two message transfer agents are needed. one at the client's end and the other at the server's end, right. So, like most client server programs on the internet, the server needs to run all the time, right, because it does not know when a client will ask for a connection. The client can be triggered by the system when there is a message in the queue to be sent. So, only when the client wants to send, the client may log in, but the server, the mail server, will always keep on running. So, the user agent at the receiver's end, the person who is receiving the site, will allow the receiver to read the received messages, okay, and they will then use the message access agent client to retrieve the message from the message access agent server running on the second server. So, there are two things which we need to understand, that first, the receiver cannot bypass the mail server, right, and use the MTA server directly. Message transfer agent directly they cannot use because to use the message transfer agent server directly, the receiver would need to run the MTA server or the message transfer agent server all the time, because he does not know when a message is going to arrive. So, this implies that the receiver must keep his computer on at all the time if he is connected to his system through a LAN, and if he is connected through a WAN, then he must keep the connection up all the time, which is not going to be feasible. So, therefore, the receiver cannot use the message transfer agent directly. So, he will need to another pair of client server program called the message access program. So, message access program is basically, it is basically the pull program, whereas the message transfer agent is a client server program, is a push program, right. So, the client will push the message to the server and the receiver is going to pull the message from the server, right. So, the client needs to pull the message when it is receiving and the client needs to push the message when it is sending the message, right. Now, we are also talking about something called the user agent. Now, what is the user agent basically? The best example of user agent would be like Microsoft Outlook Express. So, it is that kind of interface, it is a service, it is an application program which makes the process of sending and receiving messages easier. So, it's it's a program, it can be installed and the user gets the facilities to compose, to read, to reply and to forward messages, and the user agent also handles the local mailboxes on the user's computer. So, there are two types of user agents, command driven and GUI. So, command driven and GUI, we have been discussing this. Command driven, these are early days user agents, but they are still present because the underlying user agents are still command line user agents, command driven user agents. So, they will accept one character command from the keyboard to perform the task. For example, to read a message, you have to type R. To read all the messages, you have to type capital R. So, likewise, there are several command line user agents, but all modern day user agents, they are like Eudora or Outlook, they are all graphical user interface based user agents, and they allow user to interact with the software by both keyboard and mouse, just like other GUI interfaces allow us, and they use graphical components like icons, menus, windows, and these are much user friendly than the command driven user agents. Now, to send an email, the user, it's like similar to sending the envelope. So, like on the envelope we always contain the senders, receivers and other information. So, here also the similar thing is to be followed, and then the message will have a head and the body. So, the head portion will define who is the sender, who is the receiver, the subject of the message and any other information, and the body will contain the actual information which is to be read by the recipient. So, receiving the email, so user agent is triggered by the user or a timer. If a user has email, the user agent informs the user with a notification. There is a notification which is set or a notice which comes, and if the user is ready to read the mail, a list is displayed in which each line contains a summary of the information about a particular message in the mailbox, right. So, the summary will again contain who sent the message, the subject line and the time. So, user can select which messages to read and which are not supposed to be read. Now, choosing an email address also, of course, we all understand this, that there is a specific addressing system which when every mailbox needs to have a unique address. So, there are two parts to this. One is the local part separated by an ampersand, and then there is a domain part. So, it is like local part at the rate of domain part. So, local part could be any a name of a special file or the user mailbox wherever the mail is being stored and saved and retrieved, etc. And the second part, which is the domain part, is actually the organization's name which will generally use. So, domain part is assigned, or the domain name is assigned to each mail exchanger, either comes from the DNS database or it is a logical name, right. So, generally it is the name of the organization, or it can be the name of the service provider if you are using an email the mailbox services of other players like that. So, mailing lists can also be prepared, or what we call as group lists can be prepared. So, you can create an alias and several different email addresses can be clubbed using the mailing list. So, then the message will go to a number of recipients. So, in this case, if the mailing list for the defined alias separate messages, one for each entry in the list has to be prepared and handed to the MTA. So, the message transfer agent will send all the messages separately. If you have 100 addresses in the mailing list, so the message transfer agent has to handle each of them separately. The next protocol that we see in the standard protocols is the telnet protocol, which is also very commonly known as the remote login protocol. So, the server program, it can provide a specific service to its corresponding client program. For example, we know that FTP is designated to retrieve and store the files on the server side, but it is not possible to have a client server pair for each type of service that we need. A number of servers will required, and this is not a scalable idea. So, the best solution for using a client server program for a set of common scenarios, okay, but to have generic client server program and that allow user on the client side to log into the computer at the server side and use the services available there. Therefore, it is called as the remote login. For example, if a student wants to use Java compiler in the university lab, so the student need not come to the laboratory, but they can use it from wherever they are by logging into the system or the university server and using the compiler program. So, therefore, this is known as remote login. So, one of the original remote logging protocols was the telnet, which is actually short form of terminal network. So, telnet requires a logging name and password, and this is also vulnerable to hacking because it sends all the data in plain text, just like FTP and HTTP. This is also not encrypted. So, hackers can always eavesdrop and obtain the user ID. So, because of this security issue, the use of telnet has diminished in favor of the secure shell or the SSH protocol. So, although telnet is almost replaced by SSH, but still telnet needs to be discussed in detail because SSH is actually based on telnet. So, the simple plain text architecture of telnet allows us to explain the issues and challenges which may come in when you are talking about remote login. And again, this is the preferred thing which is used by the network administrators. So this is, a brief view of how the local and remote logging works. So if we look at the local login, we can see that, the operating system directly talks to the application program through the terminal and the communication happens. But when we are talking about remote login, so there are two sets of, terminals which we are looking at. One is the client terminal, and the client terminal will send the command to the telnet for the remote login, and that is received at the server's end. And at the server's end, we see that there is something called the pseudo terminal which is provided. Why? Because the operating system of the server is not going to take commands directly from the telnet server. So therefore, a pseudo terminal has to be created for this purpose, so that the commands which are coming from a remote computer are taken as if the commands are coming from the same system. Therefore, there is a need for this pseudo terminal driver which is provided. So therefore, telnet client server programs, they have become very popular, and they are used very commonly because of these characteristics only, that they allow now they allow, because of the SSL and the SSH, they allow users to access data on a remote computer very easily. So friends, this was all about the standard client server protocols which come under the TCP/IP protocol suite. Thank you for watching CEC live lectures.